Hi, this is the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. Appreciate you joining me today. I'm taking a look at one of Tim Keller's books called Making Sense of God. His more famous book that came out first that sold a lot of copies, ended up on the New York Times bestseller list, was called The Reason for God. So some people get a little mixed up between the two. The book, The Reason for God, and the book Making Sense of God really have two different audiences in mind. So he said when he wrote Reason for God, that was really for people who believe there is a God and they're seeking him. So they've already taken that first step. And then he wrote this book, Making Sense of God. He said that was for people who really weren't sure that there was a God there. So this would be, in a sense, the first book of the two, if you're reading them in order to figure out if you thought there was a God, and then you think there's a God, and now you want to know how does it work out. And so he wrote the second book, The Reason for God. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I wanted to look at I guess I should spend just a second going through some of the table of contents so you have an idea of how he's leading this book for the person who doesn't really know about God or has a lot of questions about it. So here are the areas that he discusses. Isn't religion going away? Why spend time on it if it's disappearing anyway? And then the chapter I want to do, isn't religion based on faith and secularism based on evidence? And then the section I really like a lot, and I've used that as a basis for some of my talks, religion is more than you think it is. That's his whole second section here. And he's got a third section, but the second one is, I think it's the heart of the book. What does religion do for you? Especially Christianity, of course, that's where he's going to go. A meaning that suffering can't take from you, a satisfaction that's not based on circumstances, an identity that doesn't crush you or exclude others, a hope that can face anything, a justice that does not create new oppressors. And then he moves, as you can tell, in the third section where he is hoping now people are a little more sure about God and they're willing to take that step to say, well, maybe there is a God out there. Then why Christianity? That's part 3 of the book. Is it reasonable to believe in God? Is it reasonable to believe in Christianity? So that's the big structure of the book. I think he does an excellent job. I like the things that Tim Keller puts out. He combines good theology with looking out at our culture. He makes connections for people so that they know what's going on in the news. They can connect that to Christianity. He'll quote some intellectuals who aren't even Christians and tie that into Christianity. So he does an excellent job. All right, so let's take a look at chapter 2. Isn't religion based on faith and secularism on evidence? Isn't that what we usually hear? Oh, you Christians, gee, I wish I had your faith. You have that leap of faith, and I really admire that. Actually, today a lot of people don't even admire it, but that's what they're thinking, that you've got this lack of belief and you're just hoping, and boy, you can really crank up your hope, and good for you. So anyway, he starts off and he said, he quotes a man named S.A. Joyce, who has what is popular today called deconversion stories. And he said, this is the quote now, "It's becoming clear to me that the universe behaved pretty much as might be expected if God didn't exist, or at least didn't care." He said, "It gradually dawned upon me that in the grand scheme of things, there was in fact no grand scheme. God performed no observable function and had no valid purpose." And so you can see the blinders of dogma are going away. And so it's the idea of, I prayed to know the truth, and then I discovered I was an atheist. So he said, there are a lot of these loss of faith accounts. He said they're all kind of the same in a way. The narrators will say they just didn't find any evidence for the claims of any religion. And then they wrestled with the problem of evil in a world that's supposed to be overseen by a good, all-powerful God. And then they said they soon discovered that thoughtful non-believers were committed to things like justice and equality more than religious people. So they concluded, again, these would be the loss of faith people, they concluded human beings don't need God to lead a good life and to build a good world. In fact, we could do better carrying out these tasks without any religion at all. And Keller says that's really powerful, isn't it? It shows non-belief is the result of a quest for truth and a courage to face life as it really is. Deconversion accounts, he said, also testify for the need or the desire for a world that doesn't divide all the time between true believers and infidels. The secular people feel like they're more accepting now of everybody. But Keller says, down deep, behind these stories is a deeper story, and that is religious people are living by blind faith, while secular and non-believers in God are grounding what they believe in evidence and reason. So basically, he says these stories are kind of the hero who has the courage to think for himself or herself. Reason alone can establish truth. And he says if you're moving from religion to secularism, these people say it's not really a loss of faith, it's a shift into a new set of beliefs and a new community of faith. It draws the line between orthodoxy and heresy in different places. So back to the big picture here. He said he thinks one of the main reasons secular people don't think it's worthwhile exploring anything about Christianity, they assume that belief is mainly a matter of faith, while non-belief is mainly based on religion. So he said, let's get into more depth here about these secular beliefs. So he said the first set of beliefs that many of these secular people have, he calls it exclusive rationality. What does he mean by that? That science is the only arbiter of what's real. And empirical observation is all you have and all you need. Now that's right next door to scientism, isn't it? Same idea that science offers the only truth that we can know. And so the idea that you can't know anything unless you can prove it empirically, which means in many cases you can't know anything much at all. He goes back to a man named William Kingdon Clifford. He was a British mathematician and philosopher, and he had an essay called The Ethics of Belief. And he said it's wrong always, everywhere, for everyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. And so he said there are a lot of challenges on the internet by atheists who say this to religious people. Hey, if you want me to believe in God, prove that he's out there, prove his existence. But he said that view of reason now has a lot of problems with it. It can't meet its own standard. In other words, let's go with that thesis. Don't believe it unless you can prove it empirically. But what's the empirical proof for that proposition? That's a self-refuting statement. It's like saying I can't speak a word of English. Well, you just did. But that's self-refuting too, to say you've got to trust something only if you can prove it empirically. Like put it in a test tube or weigh it or measure it somehow. But you can't do that. You can't do that with that proposition. So that's huge. I think that's really important. He says another problem is that few of the things that we believe in down deep about truth could be proven scientifically. He says you can't prove what we believe about justice and human rights, or that all people are equal in dignity and worth, or what we think is good or evil behavior scientifically. You can't do that. And he said an additional problem, he said even the criteria for proof are widely contested. So you can't even set up a set of ways to measure and decide these things. He said all of us have things we believe, even things we die for, that we can't prove. We believe them because of rational and experiences and social grounds. So he said we should stop demanding proof. That belief in God has to meet a certain standard of proof, and we don't apply that to other commitments in which we base our lives. I just give one example. I know my wife loves me, okay, but I can't prove that scientifically. But I would bet that's more true than anything else I can think of in life. Okay, so here's a second point that he's bringing up about the secular view. He calls it the view from nowhere. So he said reason depends on the faith, basically, that all of our senses, like our eyes and ears and all, are not tricking us. He said there's no non-circular way to establish that. It says, could you prove that you're not actually in a vat somewhere with plugs coming out of the back of your head feeding you an alternative reality? Think about that for a minute. Can you prove that? It says even the assertion that science and empirical evidence are the only sure ways to understand reality assumes something about the universe that you could only know by faith. Why? Well, here's a quote from an American philosopher. Science is by its very nature not fit to investigate whether there's more to reality than the natural world. Yeah, exactly. Science is set up to determine stuff, material stuff. So it's not fit. It's not made to investigate anything outside the natural world. So the same philosopher says the statement that there's no supernatural reality, or the statement there is a transcendent reality beyond this world, he said those are philosophical, they're not scientific propositions. Neither can be proven in some way that no rational person can doubt. And so if you make a declaration, science is the only arbiter of truth, that's not a scientific finding, that's a belief. So, interesting, I think. He said, take a look at things like that we can't prove. So he says, look at Hindu philosophy. The world is an emanation of an absolute spirit, and you can only understand reality through contemplation. Well, Western science says, no, things exist on their own. So if the Indian view is right, reality is not predictable. But Western science says, no, there's a closed system, and that if you're given enough empirical knowledge, you could predict and you could figure out things. But there's no experiment that can test whether that Indian view or the Western view is right. And that's the point, he says. And he mentions David Hume. He said he's argued our science is based on beliefs about the universe that can't be proven or disproven. So he said there's no view from nowhere. Everybody is starting with some kind of faith in something. Here's a third area that he's talking about as far as secular beliefs. He calls it background beliefs. He said people have all sorts of beliefs about reality and relevance, and that comes to us through our bodily experiences. Sometimes it comes to us from authorities that we trust or communities that we're part of. And we absorb them. They just come to us. They're barely conscious beliefs. We always come to observe anything with some sort of pre-understanding of existing beliefs. So we're not blank slates, I guess. He says often certain arguments sound good to us because of our background beliefs. So he said, think about the problem of evil. There's a good case study of how background beliefs control our supposedly really strict rational thought. No, he said ancient people were actually more acquainted with brutality and loss and evil than we are. Their literature, he said, just think of the book of Job. It's filled with the laments about all sorts of suffering that you don't understand. But he said, and this is what's interesting, there's virtually no ancient thinker who looked at that evil and said, therefore there can't be a God. He says, why does this argument against God's existence seem so rational and convincing today? He says modern people are really a lot more likely to lose their faith over suffering than people in times past. Why? Because our belief and our confidence in the powers of our own intellect have changed. Ancient people just figured out that the human mind didn't have enough wisdom to sit in judgment about an infinite God and how he was doing things. So he said, modern arguments against God on the basis of evil are just assuming that God must not exist if we can't figure out a reason for this evil and suffering. So I think that's interesting too. Well, he's got a lot of things here, and I don't know how much more. I'll go a little bit longer. I'm trying to see how long this chapter is. Wow. Yeah, it goes, I'm only about a third of the way through. So I may turn this into 2 podcasts. That there's a lot of information here. I don't want to go too fast. I really like Keller. And so I may make this the first part of 2. So if you're all okay with that. Here's a fourth area that the secular world believes in, and he calls it the critique of doubt. He says, even the most rigorous rational thinking has all sorts of faith in it. It says, in many cases, you can't doubt belief A except on the basis of some belief B that you believe instead. So, for example, if you say, no one can know enough to be certain about God and religion, then how are you certain about that? You must know something about religious knowledge to be certain about that. Do you see that's a self-defeating argument? Let's try it one more time. If somebody says, you can't be certain about God and religion, well, but that's a certain statement that you just made. You're certain of that. How'd you get that knowledge? He said there's an atheist blogger one time that he read, and here's what the person said. The first cause that plants the initial seed of doubt varies from person to person. However, some of the common reasons include meeting a real atheist and finding out they're not the immoral, unhappy misanthropes the believer had been led to expect, witnessing a good and faithful fellow believer suffer horribly, seemingly for no reason, witnessing institutionalized corruption or hypocrisy in the believer's religious hierarchy, realizing the basic unfairness of the doctrines of hell and salvation, or finding an unanswerable contradiction or error in the believer's scriptures of choice. Now that's an atheist. It said here are the reasons why people become atheists. But he says, wait a minute, let's go through that. So here's Keller taking apart that statement. He says, why did he become an atheist? Meeting a real atheist who is not an immoral, unhappy misanthrope. He said, well, then there's that belief that religious people are saved by God because of their goodness and morality, and that by definition then atheists should be bad. But he said biblical teaching is not that at all. It says we're saved only by undeserved grace, not by our moral character. So there's no reason why an atheist actually might be a far better person than a Christian. So it said that kind of throws away that argument. Here it says the atheist also said, witnessing a good and faithful believer suffer horribly for no good reason, that can turn people into atheists. He says, well, that doubt stems from a belief that we can't come up with a reason for an act of God, then there can't be any reason. I mean, do you see what that does? That means that somehow we're on God's level. If there's an infinite God, how could a finite mind evaluate his motives and plans? So that kind of shakes that idea. What else did that atheist say? He said, well, some people turn to atheism because they witness corruption or hypocrisy in a religious institution. But notice that. Where did this atheist get moral standards using to judge hypocrisy? Those come from Christianity itself. Right? So in other words, if you say what they're doing was sinful or is wrong, where are they getting the standard? Not just that they didn't like it, but they thought there was some standard beyond them. What about the atheist that says, well, the doctrines of hell and salvation are unfair? But if God exists, would he have a right to judge people as he saw fit? And that this doubt about hell is based on a Western, white, democratic, individualist mindset that most other people in the world don't share. They don't see a problem with hell. And then the atheist also said, well, there's an unanswerable contradiction or error in the scripture. And he said, that's interesting. He said it's sort of the idea that all religious believers have a naive, uncritical trust in the Bible. But there are actually different ways to interpret the Bible. And people have come up with a lot of answers to these so-called contradictions. All right, so he says, I think I'll do maybe another page or two here, and then we'll take a break, do another podcast. I like to keep these podcasts fairly short. I don't know if that's okay with you. If you want longer podcasts, let me know. Zacharias, Gary.Zacharias@gmail.com. And let me know if you like this. I always figure most people, if they're driving someplace, they've got 15 or 20 minutes. If they're working outside for a few minutes or whatever. I'm just trying to keep these bite-sized, but I'd be glad to make them longer if you'd like. He says, the next section is a balance of reason and faith. He said, you had the Enlightenment come along, and it felt like nothing in the subjective world was true knowledge. But on the other hand, you got 20th century thinkers like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, who attack the idea that there's any objective pole at all. We shouldn't be certain of anything. So we've got this back and forth about, what's true. He says, social scientists say what we arrive at and what we think is true, we do it through analytical thinking, through experience, through empathy, through intuition. There are a lot of ways. So the Christian believer, he says, is using reason and faith just like the secular neighbor is using reason and faith to get to their beliefs. They're both looking at nature. They're both looking at human experiences. They're both seeking a way to make the best sense through a process that's both rational and personal and intuitive and social. Reason doesn't operate by itself. So he said contemporary secular people then, it's not an absence of faith, it's a whole new set of beliefs that they have. He says, all right, so besides these beliefs about rationality, he said most secular people today have some ethical ideas about the nature of human life. They're committed to science, to progress, to the rights and equality of everybody. And so if you get religion out of the way, then it'll help us get to those values. But of course, and you know where he's probably going to go with this, because I think he's exactly right. Where did these values come from? He says you can't prove any of those moral standards about progress and the rights and equality of people and freedom for every human. Those values, those moral standards can't be proven empirically, so science can't get you there. But they don't actually follow logically even from a materialistic view of the world. It says, he has a quote here from a New York Times article about the meaning of life. When the Hubble Space Telescope pointed to a black spot in the sky about the size of an eraser head for a week, it found 30,000 galaxies over 13 billion years old with many trillions of stars and many, many more trillions of inferred planets. So how significant are you? You're not a unique snowflake. You're not special. You're just another piece of decaying matter on the compost pile of this world. Nothing of who you are and what you will do in the short time you're here will matter. Everything short of that realization is vanity. So celebrate life in every moment, admire its wonders, and love without reservation. Wow. Says you talk about a materialistic view of the world. You're just made of matter. You don't have a soul. You don't have any special purpose. There's no afterlife. Eventually what happens to the earth, it burns up. So nothing you do will make any difference. But then with that word so, we're told that we should therefore live a life of what? Celebration and love. He says, wait a minute. If we're just a decaying piece of matter in a decaying universe, why should we live a life of love toward others? Does that follow? He says, no. Why shouldn't we live as selfishly as we can get away with? How do beliefs in individual freedom and human rights and equality come out of the idea through survival of the fittest? They don't, he said. A Russian philosopher said this: the secular humanist has this way of thinking. Man descended from apes, therefore we must love one another. Huh? Of course, that second idea doesn't follow from the first. Man descended from the apes, and therefore we have to love one another? If it was natural for the strong to eat the weak in the past, why aren't people allowed to do it now? Now, of course, Keller says, I'm not saying that we should not love each other. He said, but if you have that secular view of the universe, the idea of love or social justice is not logical. It's no more logical than to hate or destroy. He says that's a deeply incoherent view of the world. If the values of secular humanism can't be inferred or they can't be deduced from this material world, where do they come from? Well, actually, he quotes Jacques Derrida, who says, the cornerstone of international law is the sacred. The sacredness of man is your neighbor, made by God or by God made man. He says, in the sense, the concept of crime against humanity is a Christian concept. And I think there would be no such thing in the law today without the Christian heritage, the Abrahamic heritage, the biblical heritage. That's interesting. Jürgen Habermas, who's, I don't think he's a Christian, I think he's also an atheist. He says that there's a growing consensus that our modern ideas of freedom, of conscience, human rights, and democracy come from where? The Bible's teaching on justice and love. And that secular society hasn't found any good alternative way to ground these ideas. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. There's a tremendous article by Arthur Leff, L-E-F-F, dealing with where are we getting these ideas of justice and freedom, and how do we make a society that way without a God? And he said it doesn't work. And so I'm going to end right there. That's I think, an excellent part of the book, and he's got so many more good things to say. But let me save that for another podcast. Okay, thanks so much for being part of this, and we will see you next time. I'll do the second half of Keller's book.